Female voice, male voice, lolly voice, monster voice.
Okay, time check muna tayo bago tayo parinig ito ng okay, balita ito mga sauke, okay, mga latest, okay, dyan po sa problema po sa Gaza, no? Okay, this is 14 minutos, pasado po alas 8, okay, sa gabing ito mga kababayan, no? Okay, 25 ng Enero 2024, and then gabi po ng Huwebes, okay, sa gabing ito mga kababayan, no? Okay, wala pa rin pagbabago dito tayo sa Consolidated News natin, balita natin. Okay. Sa platform, okay, ng ADLSNTV News Online International mga kababayan, no? Okay, so babati tayo. Good evening sa lahat. Magandang gabi sa inyo. Kumusta kayo? Okay? Yung international greeting natin, universal greeting, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Ayan po mga suki, no? Okay, nandito din naman tayo sa panggabi. Halo-halo special opinion, balita at iba pa. Okay, kasama po sa Serbisyo Publiko Tinig ng Mamamayan. Okay, at saka sumbungan ng mamamayan, no? Okay, dyan lang kayo. Pakinggan natin po yung latest po na ito, no? Okay, how is the White House spinning the media on the Gaza war? Gaza war mga kababayan, no? Okay, so okay, pakinggan natin ito. The White House, the media on the Gaza war, no? Okay. Pakinggan natin po ang kung ano po pagtrato po ng mga tagapamahayag po. Umabot ng 120, no? Okay, nadali po. Okay, dyan po sa Gaza mga suki, no? Yung mga tagapamahayag. Okay. Pakinggan natin.
I have a question. As Israel's war on Gaza approaches its 4th month with full U.S. support, who's going to be held accountable for the tens of thousands of innocent people killed? Let's get to the bottom line. In the name of destroying Hamas or any other resistance, Israel has killed more than 25,000 Palestinians in Gaza, overwhelmingly children and women, and it's maimed more than 60,000. The stories of amputations without anesthesia are countless, and they're just heart-pulsing. This war has triggered one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, where Palestinians now risk dying of hunger and disease, even though thousands of trucks filled with food and medicine are waiting literally a few miles away. Both Israel and the Biden White House still reject a ceasefire, though most of the world is demanding one. And on the political level, Israel still rejects any notion of a free and autonomous Palestine. And the U.S., while flirting publicly with the concept of a state of Palestine, is just doing very little to move any of the pieces to make it happen. So what's the off-ramp? Or has Gaza just become a quagmire for all involved? Today we're talking with investigative journalist Jeremy Scahill, editor-at-large and co-founder of The Intercept, and author of Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield. Jeremy, I've been struggling with the issue of American complicity. And I just want to start out saying, how can we be simultaneously, we meaning America, sending 2,000-pound bombs, and that wringing our hands about the humanitarian crisis. How do you see White House strategy and direction in this conflict?
I mean, I think, Steve, that the blunt reality is that there's a core amorality to the Biden administration policy. On the one hand, you've had this full-throttled support, not just militarily and rushing through emergency tank munitions and other weapons to Israel. And by the way, not once but twice, Antony Blinken went around basic congressional review processes to send more tank munitions to the Israeli military, while simultaneously expressing concern about the fate of Palestinian civilians. And often Secretary of State Blinken, and in fact the president himself, they speak as though they are sort of spectators watching a football game and they're cheering for their team or saying, oh, don't do that, when in reality, this whole thing could end quite swiftly if President Biden actually wanted it to. So I think what we're seeing is the White House spinning major media outlets and journalists to print these stories about how deeply concerned they are. How the new line is that Biden is losing patience with Bibi. But the reality is that Joe Biden's been in political office for a half century, and you can go back all the way to the 1970s and see that Joe Biden stands out in a field of pro-Israel politicians from both parties as one of the premier defenders of Israel when it's operating at its most gratuitous and engaged in what I think just bluntly should be called mass killing operations. This is not an aberration. This has been a hallmark of Biden's foreign policy career, full-throttled support for Israel when it's at its most obscene, I would say.
So what do you think the strategy is here? Are you arguing that the United States wants to clear and level Gaza, or is it something else? Is it just the fact that even someone like Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel is someone that has been reported to be at odds with Joe Biden and is known to prefer Donald Trump? Like, what is the incentive for this White House to acquiesce to what Netanyahu is doing?
Well, I think that actions speak much louder than words, and President Biden's actions are quite damning. I mean, Biden, for instance, Steve, has for decades carved out the issue of illegal expansion of Israeli settlements and has sort of used that as a pressure point to say, look, I'm not all in with Benjamin Netanyahu. Yes, he's my great friend. He's my good friend, but I disagree with him passionately on this issue. When it's come to Gaza, though, President Biden has been very aggressive in his support for Israel throughout the decades of military campaigns and supporting the merciless blockade that was imposed on Gaza. And I think that, it's a mistake to try to just take politicians at their word. I think the dark conclusion we have to draw is that much of this Gaza campaign has proceeded in a way that President Biden must support. Because at every turn, when the United States could have used its unprecedented leverage in the world to try to stop it, it has instead sent more weapons, prevented a ceasefire from being voted to go through at the United Nations, has been defending Israel against genocide allegations at the International Court of Justice. So, I think it's a mistake to say, let's let politicians' words speak for them. The actions are what matter. And, on a policy level, the actions indicate that it's proceeding exactly how the White House wants it to. More than 25,000 Palestinians dead, more than 63,000 wounded. You have women having cesarean sections with no anesthesia. Children are having limbs amputated with no anesthesia. You have a hepatitis A outbreak. You have Gazans with 1 in 480 of them access to a toilet, one toilet for every 480 people right now. I mean, this is an abomination. And I'm sorry, Antony Blinken is not at a think tank anymore. The Secretary of State doesn't get to go to Davos and say to Tom Friedman, oh, what is to be done? Because what has been done is that the United States has offered political, legal, diplomatic, and military support for a scorched earth campaign that has killed an unprecedented number of civilians in a very short amount of time, Steve.
I'd like to play a sound clip of you of the Secretary of State Antony Blinken here to get your thoughts.
None of the suffering would have happened if Hamas hadn't did what it did on October 7th, and had it made different decisions thereafter.
None of the suffering that we're seeing would have happened if Hamas hadn't taken its axe on October 7th. What are your thoughts, Jeremy?
Well, Hamas and the Palestinians could make a very similar argument to Antony Blinken that would also, lack moral clarity, which is October 7th wouldn't have happened if Israel hadn't for 75 straight years been waging a war of annihilation against Palestinians, usurping Palestinian land, imposing an apartheid state in the West Bank, gunning down Palestinians when they did what Western leaders say they should be doing, which is to demonstrate nonviolently. In 2018, 2019, during the Great March of Return, when Palestinians organized nonviolent demonstrations at the fence of the prison that they live in with Israel, Israeli soldiers engaged, and this is not my conjecture, this is a Haaretz investigative piece citing soldiers by name, boasting of how they had a competition of who could shoot the most kneecaps of the protesters or Palestinians. So, to make an argument that pretends that October 7th was the beginning of the story of Israel and Palestine, or even a war with Gaza, is really intellectually dishonest. But also, Steve, that line that Blinken has deployed many times, that John Kirby has said, that President Biden has said, that the Israelis say regularly, that all this could end if Hamas would just lay down its weapons, release the hostages, and surrender, is akin to a kind of sadistic torturer who's saying to their victim, this will all just end if you only tell us who the real terrorists are. This is sick to use the women and children, the civilians of Gaza, as sort of a pile of corpse that you're going to justify by saying, well, Hamas needs to release the hostages and lay down their weapons. There's 75 years of history here that could be pointed to that doesn't look good for Israel on a moral or political level. So I reject that. I think it's intellectually dishonest, and I think it's morally vapid.
I feel it's Vietnam. I feel if I were having watched television and seen the horrors of Vietnam, I feel in this. Do you feel that Americans are hearing or feeling this in any way at all, or Europeans or other observers are seeing this as another Vietnam?
Well, I think that on a purely analytical, historical level, I think it's an apt comparison. And, when occupying powers try to fight against a guerrilla force, and that's ultimately what Hamas is, and it's using tactics that are very similar to those used by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War, you can very quickly get yourself mired in a quagmire. And, back in November, I started talking about how it already seemed like on a tactical military level, that Israeli forces were already finding themselves in a quagmire. If you follow Hamas's communications, and by the way, I think there's a totally cartoonish portrayal of Hamas that exists in much of the Western discourse, and I think it's a journalistic error. I think we have an obligation to understand who it is that we're being told are the new ISIS or the new Nazis. But when you look at Hamas's communications, they are every single day releasing multiple videos of their attacks against Israeli soldiers. And in fact, there was a very deadly incident in mid-January. It was the single highest casualty incident that we know about of Israeli forces, when IDF soldiers and engineering corps was attempting to rig two structures in eastern Gaza outside of the Maghazi refugee camp with explosives, with mines. And there was some sort of an attack that took place from Hamas, and Hamas later released a video of it where they launched an RPG that appears to have set off a chain reaction that actually exploded the mines that these Israeli soldiers were trying to place in these buildings and brought the buildings down upon the soldiers, killing 21 of them. And I think that was in some ways a metaphor for where the war stands right now. It's sort of collapsing on the heads of the Israeli soldiers that have been sent there on this war of annihilation that Netanyahu is boasting he's not going to quit until the end. The fact of the matter is that this is becoming a war of attrition. Hamas does not seem to be taking the kinds of casualties that Israel boasted of early on. These tunnel networks, Israel has only been able to penetrate a very small fraction of them. And at every turn, you see Netanyahu doubling down, even as the families of the hostages, the families of those killed on October 7th, ordinary Israelis are increasingly questioning whether or not Netanyahu even knows what he's doing, or whether it's worth the cost to Israel to continue in this manner. So I think that there are some grave strategic mistakes that have already been made by Netanyahu in this, and the fact that the Biden administration is not at this point just sort of saying this has to stop. let's remember, Steve, when people say, oh, what can Biden do? In 2021, the last time that Netanyahu engaged in this kind of, in a sort of heavy bombardment attack against Gaza, and it was far lower in intensity than what we've seen over the past 100+ days, Joe Biden got to a point where he wanted it to end. He called Bibi. He basically said, it's burned enough. You're going to talk to the Egyptians. And within a couple of days, the thing was done. It was being wrapped up. So let's not pretend that Joe Biden doesn't have the power. And the fact of the matter is, you can read the Israeli press, which in some ways is far more open about what's going on in Gaza than the American or British press, to be honest. And you can see that some of the top defense correspondents for Israeli publications are saying what I just said, that there is real danger that this is becoming a quagmire, and that even within the ranks of the Israeli security forces, there are serious questions about whether this is a viable strategy to continue this way. But also, and I think crucially, there's an acknowledgement among the defense elite in Israel that if Biden was to threaten a cutoff of military support, particularly weapons, this thing would have to be wrapped up very, very quickly.
You know, Hamas is demanding a ceasefire and a full withdrawal of Israeli troops as terms to release hostages and to move forward. Israel has fully rejected that. It's demanding that Hamas disarm, do this. You've got maximalist positions on both sides. And, you know, it reminds you of the Ukraine conflict with Russia, honestly. You kind of see maximalist positions on both sides. What do you see as the end state that could be achieved? And are there other responsible stakeholder powers that can change the game in any way? Or is the U.S. just so dominant in the region that it's going to acquiesce to this and, you know, let it just keep going and going?
Well, yeah, I think first of all, one question that is seldom asked with any degree of sincerity in the discourse on this is, why is there a Hamas? Well, okay, part of the story is there's a Hamas because people like Benjamin Netanyahu, and specifically Benjamin Netanyahu, wanted there to be a Hamas, because Netanyahu's strategy was that if you have people perceived to be violent extremists who call for the destruction of Israel in power in Gaza, that's the best way to prevent a Palestinian state from being achieved. And the New York Times did a fantastic expose about this, documenting how Netanyahu himself helped to keep the spigot of money open from Qatar into...
Well, he kept the spigot of money open, and he helped create them, and he helped split Palestinian leadership, right? That was the whole idea.
Right. So that's one part of the story of why there's a Hamas. But more what I'm getting at is, why is there armed resistance in Gaza? If it's not Hamas, it's going to be someone else. There's armed resistance because the Palestinians have been sent a message over the course of decades that diplomacy isn't going to work, that they're not going to be taken seriously, that Israel is going to remain entrenched in its defiant position, that there really can't be a Palestinian state. We might give you some rump thing that we feel is okay, but we're not going to ever actually allow you to achieve full independent statehood. And as long as you have an apartheid state in the West Bank, as long as you have a siege being laid on the people of Gaza, as long as Israel is in control of the air, the sea, the land, what goes in and out of Gaza, you are going to have an armed resistance. And I don't think, if you study history, I don't think that there's any people in the world that would just submit to the kinds of demands that Israeli leaders have placed on the Palestinian people. So if you want to have viable peace, you have to treat the Palestinians as full human beings. You have to stop demonizing them and treating them, in the words of senior Israeli officials, as human animals. That's the only way, the only true way to peace. Palestinian Authority is deeply unpopular. The idea that you could have Mahmoud Abbas or any of the PA ride into Gaza on an Israeli tank or an American tank, that ain't gonna fly. And in fact, Hamas has become more popular as a result of this war. And it's not that Hamas's ideas are necessarily popular. It's that the armed resistance has become popular among Palestinians because, from their perspective, they're dying. They're being killed off. At least someone is trying to fight the Israelis, fight the occupiers, fight the invaders. So whether it's Hamas or another armed group, these kinds of campaigns are not going to stomp out the tenacious determination on the part of the Palestinian people to achieve their rights to an independent state and self-determination. That's just the raw facts, Steve.
You know, I brought on this show some people, part of the American military establishment, and they've all said that destroying Hamas is impossible. It is a movement, not a set of individuals. They said at the same time, Israel, for this to stabilize, is going to have to find ways to make common purpose with people. None of that seems to be happening. And so when I hear about this, and there's been talks about a Marshall Plan-like activity or rebuilding, and coming back, I'm just wondering how in the world is any of this possible down the road if the level of it's really a kind of deep hate and disdain doesn't have any off ramp. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, also one specific thing that's happening, and it's now starting to become to sort of play out in the open, is that Israel is engaged in a campaign that I think is very clearly in violation of international humanitarian law, where they're going along the sort of administrative border between Gaza and Israel right now, and they're doing controlled demolitions of buildings. That's what they were in the process of doing when those 21 IDF soldiers got killed when the landmines exploded and the buildings collapsed on them. And the stated objective, and the Israelis just admitted this for the first time, is not to destroy Hamas tunnels or infrastructure, but it's to remove any structures that could potentially pose a security risk to nearby kibbutzes. And this is quite different than saying, "Oh, we're going to blow up Hamas headquarters and tunnels." They're actually justifying what amounts to a land grab. They're calling it a buffer zone, but they're preemptively taking more of Gaza's territory. So when you have those actions taking place, when you're essentially now annexing even greater portions of Gaza and stating that there isn't going to be any population there anymore, and then you want to talk about, well, what do we do on the day after? I think the Biden administration is getting played right now by Netanyahu. I think Netanyahu understands and is hoping that Donald Trump is going to somehow pull it off and win the U.S. presidential election. Yes, Bibi and Biden are very sincerely good friends for 40 years, but I think that Netanyahu understands that Biden's going to have to start thinking about his own election prospects and how this is going to affect it. It's not just Arab Americans, Steve, that are deeply concerned about this and are indicating that they're not going to vote for Biden, that they're going to sit out. But I think the U.S. standing in the world is going to start to be called into question, because this business of bombing Yemen and going after Ansar Allah and sort of ratcheting up the low-intensity conflict that's going on in Iraq, while at the same time saying we seek no wider war, this is putting American allies in Europe in a very precarious position. And I think that Joe Biden could have been a one-term president. He could have been very popular. He could have said, I saved the world from Donald Trump. I'm going to focus on my domestic agenda. But instead, what we've seen is Biden now getting himself completely affiliated with a heinous war that has killed more than 25,000 civilians, is not going to be wrapped up in a neat bow in time for the 2024 election. And I think it's really hard to draw any conclusion other than Biden supports this with some minor caveats because he's allowing it to continue. There's a tinderbox here that's blowing, and it's blowing up right as the U.S. election is getting underway.
Jeremy, I've read you for years. I've been reading your recent powerful exposés and analysis of what's going on. You're not pulling your punches like others in American media, global media have done on this crisis. How are you doing? How is The Intercept doing playing this role?
When you stake out this position, and we had done a big series on Joe Biden and his politics over 50 years, right when he was inaugurated, and I did the lead reporting on the Israel section of it. I knew as soon as Hamas led those raids on October 7th that this was going to be a paradigm-shattering moment. The Intercept has staked out a position because we don't believe in objectivity as it's defined by corporate elite media outlets and politicians. We believe accuracy is the most important component of journalism, but sometimes, Steve, the truth is just true. And in this case, we have a historic moment where the United States, Germany, Britain are on the wrong side of history. And I think that it takes journalistic principles to stand up and say, you know what, we believe that our readers have the right to understand the cold hard facts. And we get a lot of mail and messages from people saying they're not going to donate to The Intercept anymore, that they aren't going to support The Intercept anymore. It's a very difficult fundraising environment given what The Intercept has been reporting on over the past several months. We wouldn't change it for anything, Steve, because I think it matters, and I'm ashamed of our colleagues in American media for the silence over the killing of our journalistic colleagues from Al Jazeera, independent Palestinian journalists on the ground. You know, this is, we all were shocked and horrified when Jamal Khashoggi was killed. I was outraged, angry. I think Evan Gershkovich should be freed from his prison in Russia. Shireen Abu Akleh, an American citizen working for Al Jazeera, was assassinated by Israel in the West Bank, and the Biden administration has stymied the investigation into her killing. Dozens upon dozens of our colleagues have been murdered along with their family members in Gaza. We cannot be silent. We must speak up in defense of our colleagues and stand in solidarity. The murder of journalists must stop. This must be called for from the highest levers of power in the United States and in elite media. Democracy dies in the darkness. Our colleagues are being killed in broad daylight. It's got to stop.
Wow, Jeremy, thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Powerful. Jeremy Scahill, co-founder and editor at The Intercept. Thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
So what's the bottom line? Blowback was a term used by the CIA and made popular by the book Blowback, Consequences of American Empire by Chalmers Johnson during the U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Israeli leaders swear that nothing's going to stop them from flattening Gaza and destroying any possibility for life in the Gaza Strip for years to come. My guest argues that none of this could have happened without full U.S. support, which makes this country complicit in this ongoing horror. Generations of Palestinians are now going to have to try and pick up pieces of their lives, but it's not going to be their problem alone. This has now become one of the world's biggest problems. Responsibility for Gaza and the Palestinian issue at large now falls on the shoulders of the whole world, not just the Arab world. The anger and the nightmares that are going to seed from a future Gaza will find legitimacy in this horrible time, just like the U.S. adventures in the Middle East at the beginning of this century. Intended or not, the consequences of this war in Gaza are going to sow the seeds of payback or blowback, and no one knows how or when the bills are going to come due. And that's the bottom line.
Female voice, male voice, lolly voice.
Okay. Okay, tayo rito sa Pilipinas, media group dito sa Pilipinas. Okay, mahigit 100 mahigit 120 na, no? Namatay, tahimik lang po mga kababayan, no? Silent lang ang mga grupo natin sa kanila. Okay, itong grupo po sa ibang bansa, okay, kinokondemn po nila yung mga tagapagbalita, okay, kinatay po dyan sa Gaza Strip, no? Tayo, hindi, silent lang po mga kababayan. Okay, sobra pa po sa Maguindanao massacre, ito nga nangyari po sa mga trabahante, okay, mga professional media, okay, dyan namatay po sa Gaza, no? Ayan. Itong si Wael Al-Dahdu, okay, correspondence po ng Al Jazeera, okay, 2 anak, asawa, at saka isang anak ata babae, no? Okay, na-target po ang kanyang bahay. Ayan. Ako nag-condemn na ko mga kababayan, no? Nauna pa ko mag-condemn nung mga nangyari po yon, mga suki. Ayan. So, yan po. Tayo tahimik lang, no? Okay, tahimik lang po mga kababayan, baliwala. Yung mga kapwa natin po ay kinakatay lang mga suki, no? Baliwala lang. Okay, sandali lang. Kapwa natin yung parehas trabaho natin eh. Ayan. Doon sila magtrabaho, parehas din ng trabaho natin dito sa Pilipinas. Ayan. Okay, 43 minutos. Pasado na po alas 8 ang time check natin, no? Okay, saan na pupunta? Sandali lang. Okay, mga suki, malungkot, no? Okay, mga media magtrabaho po sa mag-cover po ng matinding bakbakan ganun na po ang ang nangyari sa kanila, no? Okay, sabi po ni kaibigan Raisa Robles, Congressman Joy Salceda should identify who the person are behind the latest chat. If he says he doesn't, then how does he know the signature campaign has reached the required 12% question mark? Who is he talking to? Public has right to know. Okay, tama po. Okay, si Raisa Robles, no? Tayo, mga mamamayan, okay, may karapatan po dapat malaman natin yan, mga suki, no? Ako talaga, ako'y mag-object. Okay, simula pa. Hindi ako mag-suporta po itong sa People Initiative, no? Okay. Pangalagaan po ang 1987 Constitution, no? Ang Freedom Constitution, wag muna nating galawin, mga kababayan, no? Okay, I'm not in favor. Okay, nagalawin po ang Constitution, no? Hayaan mo na dyan. Kung talagang yayaman tayo, mayaman naman talaga ang Pilipinas, no? Okay, hindi yung Constitution ang magpayaman natin. Tayo mismo po, mga Pilipino, okay, magpayaman. Okay, ng sarili natin po, mga kababayan, no? Hayaan mo muna. Okay, I will join Raisa Robles, mga kababayan. Okay, mag-oppose. Okay, paggalaw po ng Constitution 19 Freedom 1987 Freedom Constitution, no? Okay. Kung ang problema sa mga economic article, kailangan ma-amend, ayan po ang gusto nila, bakit naman marami naman investor papasok sa atin, mga kababayan, no? Okay, hindi po katwiran yun. Ayan. Hindi po katwiran. Kung yan lang po ang problema, no? Baka sabi ng iba, ay gusto po maging Prime Minister, mga kababayan, no? Diba tama, Raisa Robles? Ayan. Ay maging Prime Minister, no? Kasi mahirap po magkuha ng botohan, no? O pagkuha ng presidente. Okay, ayan. So, okay. May karapatan po, sabi ni Raisa Robles, ay public has right to know, no? Ayan. Sige, Raisa. Okay. Sige. Okay, tutol lang taong bayan, pagkalaw po ng People Initiative, okay, sa ating Constitution, no? Pero kung ganyan okay, pera-pera, nako. Ibang kapangyarihan ng pera, no? Ayan. Sige. Okay, ang Islamic banking daw is Islamic banking just a scam? Pakinggan natin po mga kababayan na. Okay, bakit nasabi niya ito? Okay, walang katuturan. Ayan. Is a scam? Sige po. Bakit? Okay. Bakit walang sound? Lipat natin, no? Okay, lipat natin. Wala problema. Sige lang. Okay. Ano? Okay, it's a sum, no?
A conventional bank calls it interest rate, and an Islamic bank calls it a profit rate. A conventional bank will seize your property if you default. An Islamic bank will seize your property if you default. An Islamic bank gives you money for home financing, and a conventional bank does exactly the same thing. A conventional bank uses something called fractional reserve banking, where they keep only a reserve of the money and lend out far more than that. And guess what? An Islamic bank does pretty much the same thing. All of this begs the question, is Islamic banking just a sham? Hello folks, and welcome back to the IFG channel. Today I want to address a question that many of you have asked in the comments a number of times. Is Islamic banking like a pig with a beard? Is Islamic banking like a wolf in sheep's clothing? Is Islamic banking just pulling the wool over our eyes? And make sure that you watch right till the end, because there's a lot of nuance here and a lot of complicated stuff being covered, and I want to make sure that you don't miss anything or misunderstand anything. I will be saying things that might even sound slightly contradictory to each other. Just make sure that you watch till the end. Before we dive in, a very exciting announcement. We have rebranded. That's why you'll see a new logo. Our website looks completely different. And even this video has been spruced up a bit as well. For those of you who are familiar with IFG.VC, our VC Angel Syndicate, well, that has rebranded as well. It's called Curate Capital, CUR8 Capital. And the reason why we've changed the name is because it's a lot more than just venture investing now. We also do all sorts of other alternative assets, starting with real estate and lots more exciting stuff to come. The idea is that we are curating institutional grade investments that ordinary folk have historically not had access to. Even relatively affluent ordinary folks have not had access to this stuff. All that will change because we are going to give that access, and then we're going to syndicate it down to our community. The second announcement is on IFG Wealth, our investing platform where you can compare and track your investments. We have added in Her Majesty the Queen as part of our insights page. So what happens is, if you track your portfolio, you can now compare your portfolio to what the Queen is up to. I imagine there'll be less than hers, but you can also pick up some interesting tips in terms of how she puts together her portfolio and get some ideas for yourself. Have a play and let us know what you think. It is true that Islamic finance often turns upon the technicalities, but it is also true that the technicalities have a material impact on the risk profile, the legal structure, the tax structure, the commercial implications. Everything changes. The regulatory implications, everything changes. Most people who say that Islamic finance is a sham don't understand this nuance. Let's give you an example. For example, you want to buy a pencil worth £10. You don't have £10. So what you do is you go to Jeremy and say, look, Jeremy, can you give me £10 as a loan and I'll pay you back £15 later on? Jeremy says, okay, cool. He gives you the loan, you go ahead and you buy the pencil, and then over the next 6 months to a year, you pay that £10 off, and you pay £5 interest on top of that. That is debt financing. Now you have equity finance. So you go to Bilal and you say, look, Bilal, I don't have £10, I have maybe like £2. Why don't we go into a partnership? You buy £8 worth, I buy £2 worth. over time, I will buy out your £8 and I'll pay you some rent for the £8 that you own as well. And overall, you'll end up with £15. Now, commercially, that is exactly the same thing. What's the difference? Well, the difference is that Bilal has taken ownership risk. So if the pencil gets destroyed, then Bilal loses that £8. And he doesn't get the chance to charge any rent on it as well, because what you're going to rent out if it doesn't exist. And that's the key difference, because the risk reward profile is different. And often you will only really see the proper implications of the difference when things go wrong, which most of the time they don't. And I know some of you might be thinking, but Ibrahim, isn't this all really just the same thing? You're trying to sugarcoat stuff. You're trying to use weasel words, but it's all the same. Well, let's have a look at what the Quran has to say about this, because it deals with this point precisely. The Quran says, those who consume interest will stand on the day of judgment like those driven by madness by Satan's touch. That is because they say trade is no different than interest. But Allah has permitted trading and forbidden interest. The verses in Arabic say that they say it's basically the same thing. It's like each other. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying there is a distinction. One is forbidden and the other one is not. And as we've just discussed, it has a material implication as well in terms of the risk reward profiles. And you know, the world that is created by this kind of investment is different to the world that is created by an interest-based economy. A really obvious difference is that when you are just giving debt, when Jeremy is just giving that debt, he doesn't really care what happens to the pencil or the quality of the pencil or anything to do with the business model that you're going to adopt with that pencil. He just cares that you give back £15 at the end of the year. That's it. However, Bilal, on the other hand, really does care about the pencil because that's what he's investing in. And he does care about your business model because that's what's going to get him the rent. And so the due diligence and the analysis that is conducted by people in the overall economy becomes much better. And actually, by the way, the due diligence and analysis being shoddy was some of the reasons why we had the global financial crisis, because people were giving out mortgages to people who shouldn't have had mortgages. And they were doing that because they knew that it was just a debt and they could flog on that debt and it wasn't their problem any longer. The second big benefit that you get for the overall economy is that you have a lot more innovation happening because people are now having to make investments with considerable risk attached to it. And typically progress and innovation happens whenever you are taking some kind of risk and there is some kind of innovation happening. That's not the case when it comes to debt financing usually. Having said all of that, I know for a fact that many Islamic banks do use financial engineering just to replicate conventional structures, and they are not particularly interested in doing the purely Islamic things and achieving that kind of ihsan level of perfection when it comes to Islamic financing. Indeed, many Islamic banks are actually staffed and even led by non-Muslims. That alone is not enough to malign them in any way. However, it does make the point pretty clear that ultimately Islamic banks are a profit-driven organization, and so they are likely to go for those options that are going to make them the most profit, and those options are usually by aligning themselves up with conventional structures as much as possible. But the overarching point is a simple one that is brought out by that, which is that the profit motive is the key thing for Islamic banks, and the thing that usually makes the most profit is by just mimicking the conventional structures. So as such, for an Islamic bank, absent any external pressure, what they should do is they should try to mimic as much as possible conventional structures and then make sure that they make the cosmetic tweaks to get the Islamic scholars happy that this is actually Sharia compliant. An easy example of this is that Islamic banks don't typically use the structure involving Bilal and involving the renting of the pencil. They use something called commodity murabaha or tawarruk, and they use it pretty excessively. Here's how it goes. Let's say that you want to get £100 as a loan. So what you do is you go to the bank and you say, can you buy me £100 of steel? So the bank goes ahead and it gives you £100 of steel, and it says, this is your steel now, but you owe us £150 that you have to give it back in a year's time. So you're now sat with £100 of steel, and so what you do is you sell it back to the market, the steel market, and you receive back £100 because it was worth £100. So now you're sat with £100, you've got rid of the steel, possibly back to the same place you bought it from, the bank bought it from, and the bank is owed £150. So you have in effect created a loan of £100 with a return to the bank that is more than that. And that is technically permissible using commodity murabaha. Scholars have historically allowed this and put strict guidelines in place in terms of how it must be done. Some scholars do not allow this, by the way, as well. And the scholars who do allow this did this for the very simple reason that you need this kind of easing approach so that Islamic banks can get themselves comfortable and get up and running. However, 30, 40 years have now passed since Islamic banking properly started, and we are still using commodity murabaha structures. Islamic banks are still using those temporary solutions that are allowed to get them going. Is that what the Sharia wants? Absolutely not. So how do we fix this? The solution is not to lay into the Islamic banks and think that that is going to solve everything. We must appreciate that we are operating in a system where 97% of our money supply is created through the issuance of debt. So the very fabric of our economy is based on interest-based lending. And so in that system, if you are trying to carve out an Islamic finance niche, then you are always going to be tinkering at the edges. And so that's why Islamic banks often feel like they are tinkering at the edges, because, well, they are. And of course, they don't help themselves because they are often using Sharia compliance as a marketing tick box. And they are really focused on profits and not that focused on the benefit of Islamic finance in 10, 20 years' time, or the benefit of the community in 10, 20 years' time. They are focused on short-term profits. But that makes them an easy target. And I would humbly put forward that actually it's not that impactful to attack them or bring them down. It's neither here nor there. And let's play it out a bit, particularly in the West. Let's say we've got, probably a handful of Islamic banks, and you say to them that, look, we want you to go as Sharia compliant as you possibly can be, put aside the profit motive. For a start, stop using fractional reserve banking. You're going to have to give out £100 of loans if you have £100. And once that has gone out, you're not allowed to give any more out until that money comes back or until you get money from elsewhere. What's going to be the implications of that? Well, you know what's going to happen? Immediately, Islamic finance and its availability is going to go down by at least 10x. And so that's going to mean that less people are going to have their homes financed. And already there's a huge demand, much more so than the supply of Islamic finance in the market as it is. So that's going to just go crazy. And secondly, because Islamic banks are now essentially just a glorified landlord, they're not really a bank anymore, they will have to charge market rate rent. And when they do that, the prices for Islamic financing will go up. And so those people who say, oh, look, Islamic banks are fleecing us because, we're Muslims and so they're going to charge us more, well, they're going to just increase in their volume. And all of that is caused by us pressurizing the Islamic banks. Meanwhile, on conventional street, conventional banks are still happily printing money, they're still happily issuing debt, and they're still happily bidding up the prices of houses as a result of that debt as well. And so house prices are going to continue increasing. More and more Muslims are now sat on the sidelines sitting this out and getting priced out of the market. And the ones that do get onto the housing ladder are going to be paying a heck of a lot more than they were previously. Is all of this halal? Yes, absolutely, unambiguously, it is halal. And I want to be really clear here. What I'm describing is not an argument to say, leave the Islamic banks alone. What I'm describing here is the implication of trying to get rid of Islamic banks and then trying to create another structure within the wider un-Islamic conventional system, we're going to end up with a worse or equally bad solution as we currently have. So what then is the solution? Right. Imagine you have a strip club. Actually, don't imagine that. Do not imagine that. And Kabzi, I don't want you to put any B-roll from a strip club into this as well. Okay, so let's say you have a strip club and you start campaigning in the strip club that I really want a prayer room in the strip club because, you know, you need to pray, right? It's like an airport. You need to pray in a strip club. That's the problem, you see? It just sounds absurd. And even if you, let's say you do campaign and you do get a prayer room in the strip club, great. You know, you've achieved something small and, you know, relatively insignificant. The point of all of the effort should be to get rid of the strip club or to get it to change to something that's a lot more Islamic. That's the point. That's what we should be doing with finance as well. And you know, there's a hadith. When I say the strip club, people go, hang on, Ibrahim, that's a bit unfair. Why are you bringing in that kind of stuff in here? Well, there's a hadith about how the lowest form of interest and taking that is like doing adultery with one's mother. That's not my words, that's a hadith. So this is serious stuff, and this is exactly the kind of sin level that we're talking about. So what are the solutions? Here are three things that I think all of us in Islamic finance and all consumers should be really focused on. As a Muslim community, we should all be robustly and rigorously putting forward ideas and campaigns about changing the structure of our economic system. There are some great works out there done by people like positivemoney.org, which is a non-profit organization that campaigns and researches on these precise topics that call for a system of banking and monetary policy that is radically different and makes sense and has the support of leading economists to replace what we currently have. And you know the sad thing? Muslims should be at the forefront of all of that campaigning, and yet we're sadly nowhere to be seen in that discourse. The basic point that Positive Money are making is that our financial system doesn't need to have a money supply that is created primarily through the issuance of debt by private banks. Instead, it could be put in the hands of a people's bank or a people's infrastructure fund that uses that money creation to fund large infrastructure and helpful projects across society that are needed, rather than just pumping up house prices and asset prices. What that does is it creates a much reduced banking sector that doesn't use fractional reserve banking anymore and actually is just going to be an intermediary like it used to be 50, 60, 70 years ago between those who had savings and those who wanted those investments. And the bank would be a small but important part of the overall economy rather than what it is today, which is a sprawling monster that far outgrows the wider economy as a whole. The second thing that we can and must do is that for all organizations like ourselves, when you are setting up an Islamic finance product or a fund or whatever, make sure that it's not just technically Sharia compliant. Make sure that you are focused on doing real good in the world. So an Islamic fund should automatically mean that it is an ethical fund. It's an impactful fund. It ticks all of the ESG requirements. It potentially meets the UN SDG goals. All of those kind of things should be part and parcel of what it means to be Sharia compliant. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he describes halal food, he says halal and tayyib. He says halal food is good, but it needs to be beneficial and pure, and it takes things to the next level. The two things must not be divorced from each other. The third thing is use Islamic banks, because if Islamic banks were to collapse or disappear entirely, it would be a pretty big step, I think, in the wrong direction. I know Islamic banks are not perfect, and I know it's going to be tough to change them, but I think we should use them, but then also really vocally tell them, look, guys, you need to clean your act up. You need to actually do something that is useful for society. And don't expect, by the way, Islamic banks to change the world or to change themselves. The way I think about Islamic banks is, look, just clean your act up. And we shouldn't expect Islamic banks to somehow lead a revolution in Islamic finance overnight, because it's just not going to happen. They're all cumbersome and staffed by people who probably aren't the right people to lead that kind of change. The change, I think, is going to come from Islamic fintechs that are working on compelling and interesting projects structured in a different way. That's where the change is going to come from. And we should definitely support these kind of organizations. But that doesn't mean that we ignore and abandon the Islamic banks, because, like it or not, they are important. So there we have it, folks. Those are my thoughts right now on Islamic banks. So are they a sham then? Well, the answer, if I haven't made it clear, is it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter how you feel.
Islamic banks are imperfect and they're not particularly motivated to do the thing that is needed, and they're probably not well suited to do the thing that is needed. Sure, we should encourage them to clean up the act, just like we should make sure that if there is a prayer room in a strip club, it's well looked after. But the real thing is to go after the system itself and to make sure that that is much more aligned to something that is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have wanted. But the real thing is to try and change the system as a whole, to try and go after the strip club itself, and to make sure that our financial system as a whole is as close to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have wanted. And if it isn't, to continue fighting the good fight in that direction, because that is what we will be judged on. And if you live in a Muslim land, then arguably your argument is a lot simpler to make, because you're living in a majority Muslim land, for heaven's sake. So make sure that you are vocally putting that point across. And there are countries that have made some significant progress in this space. So people like Saudi Arabia are really supportive of Islamic finance, Oman, Pakistan, and others. However, we now need to push them to make sure that it's not just Islamic finance in name, but it is Islamic finance in substance as well. That's all for today, folks. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.
Waalaikumsalam. Okay, waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh, no? So, yan po ang is Islamic banking just a sham? Tapos question mark. So, yan po ang question po ng kapatid natin yun, no? Ayan. Okay. So, unti-unti yan mga suki, no? Okay, dapat itong mga LGU sa BARM o kaya sa BARM government talagang kailangan magpa-train po ng itong Islamic banking, no? Okay, para matuto tayo, okay, na free of riba mga kababayan, no? Ayan, itong mga official natin po sa BARM government, okay, ay dapat matuto sila rito mga suki, mga kababayan, no? Okay, maging matalino sila. Okay, yung mga local government units, no? Halimbawa, probinsya ng Basilan, eh dapat may mga grupo po ay kahit lang sa likuran ba, okay, mag-advise po ng itong about Islamic finance, Islamic banking, Islamic economy, and Islamic development mga kababayan, na. Okay, kahit lang sa likod, hindi pwede yan. Huwag mo gawin. Ayan. Okay, kayang-kaya po mga kababayan, no? Ayan. Pero kung lasap ka na lang kung ano-ano, lasap ka na lang kahit alam mo na hindi pwede, ayan po ang pinakamahirap mga suki, no? Okay, kahit anong source, okay, kahit anong source ng pagkain mo ay nguya ka lang ng nguya, okay mga suki, no? Kaya wala tayong barkat. Okay, wala pong barkat po mga kababayan ang buhay natin dito sa daigdig, na puro riba. Ayan, puro riba po mga kababayan, na. Okay, so ang advokasya natin ay kapayapaan, free of riba. Okay, at saka Sharia compliance mga kababayan, na. Ayan. So, sandali lang, no? Ito muna. Wala nang oras. Okay. Ayan. Okay, kaya tumulong kayo sa programa ito, no? Okay, mag-advokasya po ng kapayapaan, mag-advokasya ng pre-riba. Okay, mag-advokasya ng Islamic banking lesson, Islamic finance, okay, Islamic economy, at saka itong Islamic development, mga kababayan, no? Okay. Ayun po ang pinopokus natin, no? Kasi hindi po pwede talaga. Okay, hindi po pwede itong mga riba sa atin, no? Ayan. Okay. Saan tayo pupunta? Mag-break muna? Oo, no?
Monster voice, female voice, male voice, lolly voice.
Okay, ang Mind of Global Food Lines nag-exist na ilang pung taon na, no? Ilang pung taon na? 2010, okay, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. Okay. 2020, 2021, 2023, 2024, ilan pa, ilang 14 years or 15 years. Ayan po mga kababayan, hindi po para mangutang po ng na may interest mga suki, no? Okay, ang ginagawa ko kung wala ng kapital, tigil muna. Okay, mag-aantay po na merong kapital. Okay, ganun po ang technique ko mga kababayan, no? Hindi makatikim po ng itong Mind of Global Food Lines ay umutang po ng may interest mga suki, no? Okay, hindi talaga. Hindi siya papasok po sa ganun dealing. Bahala na hindi ay hindi biglaan na lumago. Basta hindi siya mangutang po na may interest mga suki, no? Ayan. So, 14 years mo o 15 years na? Since 2010. Ayan po mga suki, no? Okay. Kaya sinabi ko itong negosyo ito, magtinda po ng kakanin, magtinda po ng yung dates ba? Hulma sa Arabic, no? Kulma. Okay. Kung ano-ano po mga kababayan, magtitinda ng isda. Okay. Magtitinda ng nakatinda mga crab. Okay, crab po mga kababayan, no? Okay, so kahit pa paano po, since 2010 hanggang 2024 po mga kababayan, ang Mind of Global Food Lines nag-exist. Okay, hanggang ngayon po mga kababayan, no? Mas lalo na po tumibay dahil meron na po mga physical store, meron pang online, okay, may mga payment system, okay, yung mga bill, pwede magbayad po doon sa tindahan, magbayad po ng mga SSS, okay, magbayad po ng ilaw, magbayad po ng tubig, magbayad ng PhilHealth. Okay, pwede po doon mga kababayan, no? Marami yung nakalista doon. Okay, payment system po ang itong Mind of Global Food Lines, no? Kukunti lang ma-charge, mga 8 pesos, 10 pesos. Ayan po mga suki, mga kababayan, no? Okay. Ano ito? Okay, the rise of Islamic finance knowledge work. Pag nga natin ito, haba naman ito. Okay, sandali lang, no? Ayan.
Well, thank you, Jerry, for that very generous introduction, as always. And thank you very much to the audience for coming along this evening. Now, I wanted to start off with a few facts, which are probably familiar, that there's 1.6 billion Muslims who represent 25% of the world's population. There's 57 member countries of the Organization of Islamic Countries.
A conventional bank calls it
Although we
interest rate.
think of
Islamic bank calls it
Islam
profit
and
rate.
often equated in our mind with the Middle East, only 20% of Muslims live in the Middle East. The largest Muslim communities are in Asia.
35% ng Muslim, no?
1/5 of Muslims live in a country where Islam is a minority.
57 countries.
Most populous is, of course, India, 160 million Muslims, but there are 38 million in Europe and 5 million in the Americas. Islam is the world's second largest religion, behind Christianity, 2.2 billion, and Hinduism, 1.4 billion. Now, the topic, of course, is about Islamic banking and finance, and that has been growing very rapidly. Now, that shows the growth of Islamic finance from 2007 to 2010. And this is a period when Western banks were struggling. And so we can see that Islamic finance has been growing very strongly during a period in which conventional banking has been lapsing. Now, the global size is 1.13 trillion US dollars, and the average growth rate has been around about 20% per annum for a large number of years now. Now, that may sound a large figure, but I think we need to put it in perspective. 1.13 trillion is about half the size, or in fact less than half the size of one bank alone, one conventional bank alone, namely the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. So Islamic finance has been growing.
1.3 trillion ng assets po ng ang Islamic banking
System. Now, Malaysia, which has been, I believe, in the news recently in South Australia, has grown to become the third largest market for Islamic finance. It's the world's largest issuer of sukuk, which are Islamic bonds, and these offer returns comparable to conventional bonds. And that is one reason why Islamic finance has appeal. It's offering returns comparable to that of conventional finance. And PwC report that in Malaysia, 50% of the Islamic banking customers are non-Muslims. Now, Islamic banks also at present hold more capital and are more profitable than conventional banks, and perform better during the global financial crisis, or GFC, as Australia is unique in calling it. Now, one impact then of the GFC has been an increased interest in the soundness and resilience of the Islamic financial model. Not a single Islamic bank anywhere has needed to be bailed out with taxpayers' money, which of course cannot be said of the conventional banking industry. Now, there were some difficulties in the Dubai real estate, which required the reconstruction of the Dubai Islamic Bank, but no taxpayers' money were involved. Now, Islamic banks were not caught up with exposure to the so-called toxic assets that blighted conventional banks. The product offerings and investments of Islamic banks are relatively conservative compared with conventional banks, and this experience of lack of failure, offering relatively simple products, and the fact that they were not blighted by the toxic assets has led many to ask, would the global financial crisis have occurred if Islamic principles had been followed? Well, I think that's a very interesting question, and I'll try to answer it at the end of the presentation. Now, just some brief information. What is Islam? Well, the origin of the word means tranquility or inner peace. The term Islama means to submit oneself with complete peace of mind, and this is the basis of the word Muslim, so that Islam can be defined very simply as submission to God or surrender to God, and of course the Arabic name for God is Allah. Now the word of God is given in the Holy Quran, which was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad between 610 and 632 Common Era dating. Now the basis of Islamic finance comes from Islamic law, the Sharia. The Sharia means simply the source of all life. And the Sharia consists of, first of all, the Holy Quran, secondly, the Sunnah, the practices of the Prophet, which are then clarified by scholarly consensus, and qiyas, which is analogy. Now, Islamic trade and finance, like all part of a Muslim's life, has to conform with the Sharia. This is the way, the source of life. Now, the basis then of Islamic financing principle comes in terms of the term, which I must admit my co-author and I termed, justice in exchange. And to understand this, we need to look at the differences between Christianity and Islam. Now, Christianity was born, if you like, into a world which was predominantly feudal. So most transactions were in kind, and indeed the major source of production in the early feudal world was the church itself. The church itself accounted for 50% of production. So Christianity then was born into a feudal system of which the largest feudal landowner was the church itself. By contrast, Islam was born into the merchant towns of Arabia. And so exchange and market transactions were the normal part of life in the Arabian trading towns. So that the market existed, and consequently Islam had to come to terms with the market. And so the basis of justice in exchange is that trading was extolled in the Holy Quran, and forms of unjust exchange were elucidated. So trading in general was welcomed, whereas Christianity by and large was opposed to trade, and a system of just exchange was thus mandated. So exchange was accepted, indeed welcomed, in Islamic law, but you had to conform to certain principles for the trade to be considered to be just. So that Islamic financial instruments must avoid the payment or receipt of interest, which in Arabic is riba. Riba simply means increase. Next, they must avoid unconditional reward. Some risk must be assumed to justify returns. Third,
Okay, hindi ko maubos itong kuan nito, no? Okay, overtime na ko ng 15 minutos. Palagay ko, saka na lang natin balikan ito kung makita pa natin muli, no? Ayan. Hindi na talaga kaya. Okay, overtime na masyado. 1 oras at saka 15 minutos na po at saka ilang segundo. Okay. Tama na po ang public service, no? Ayan. Ayan. Australian Muslim po ito mag-lecture ito, no? Australian Muslim. Ayan. Ayan.
Monster voice, female voice, male voice, lolly voice,
Okay, yan po ang napag-aralan natin sa gabing ito. Okay, about Islamic finance, Islamic banking, okay, Islamic economy, at saka fintech. Okay, Islamic fintech mga kababayan, no? Ayan. Yung system ba ginagamit sa sa mga platform, application po ginagamit po sa bangko, pero Islamic. 'Yan po ang maintindihan natin 'yon, no? Para maintindihan natin. Okay, application 'yon sa mga internet. Pero Islamic fintech po mga kababayan. Authenticated Islamic fintech, no? Pero kaya katulad ni sinabi niya kanina, no, mangutang ka ng $100 and then kung magbayad ka $100 o kaya depende sa agreement, no, mangutang ako ng Mind of Global Food Lines ng halagang $100 o kung ilang dollar yon, and then ibalik ko sa kanya po na may depende po sa kasunduan namin, no. Okay, sabi ko utang ako sa iyo ng mga $500. And then pag isauli ko sa iyo, kasama na po doon po sa pagkasunduan namin, no, kung ilang percent. Pero kasama siya, kung lugi po dong 500 niya, kasama siya sa lugi. Kung tumubo, ay kasama siya sa tubo. Hindi po interest. Yan po ang ibig sabihin po na walang interest po ang pagpautang ng pera, no? Okay, mangutang ako ng $500, isauli ko po yung $500 kasama na po ang income ng negosyo namin, no? So, depende na sa usapan, sa agreement namin, kung may kasulatan kami mga kababayan, no? Dapat talagang uniform, dapat may kalakip po agreement pag magutang ka ng pera, no? Okay, hindi ka maningil buwan-buwan 10%. Yun po ang talagang direct riba mga kababayan, no? Okay, 10%. Tumubo at saka hindi tumubo ay 10% pa rin sa iyo mga kababayan, no? Okay, kawawa po ang negosyante. Dapat, okay, pag lugi kayo dalawa. Pag tumubo kayo dalawa. Ayan po mga suki, no? Okay, so hindi po masasabi mo na riba yun mga kababayan, no? Okay, pero pag umutang ka and then steady po ang 10% mo, ilagay mo sa tindahan and then okay, steady po ang 10% mo buwan-buwan. Yun po ay hindi po pwede mga kababayan, no? Okay, yun po sa explanation kanina po nauna mga kababayan, no? Okay, mga suki natin. Okay. So, paano? Okay, para alam tayo, okay, dito sa Consolidated News natin, sa gabing ito, okay, dito po sa channel, platform po ng ADLSNTV News Online, okay, Channel Corporation mga kababayan, no? Okay, sa programa po Halo-Halo Special, Opinion, Balita at iba pa, karami po serbisyo publiko tinik ng mamamayan. And then, sumbungan ng mamamayan po mga kababayan, mga suki natin, na. Ayan. Okay. At least ay makakuha kayo o sa pamagitan ng programa natin. Okay, kung matulis ang tainga nyo, matalim ang tainga nyo, makuha po yung mga explanation, no? Kahit walang visual, walang image. Ayan po mga kababayan, no? Mahal kasi po pag magkaroon po ng visual image po mga kababayan ng itong channel natin, no? Mahal. Ayan. So dahan-dahan po mga kababayan, no? Sa pamagitan po ay pakikinig, mamulat kayo na ganun pala. Okay, ang mga pasikot-sikot po mga kababayan sa daigdig, no? Ayan. Okay, magpaalam ako sa gabing ito. Friday naman bukas. Pero magprograma tayo bukas po mga kababayan, no? Weekend. Ayan. Inshallah. Ayan. So paalam tayo. Okay, nawala tayong masamang tinapay po mga kababayan, no? Okay, mga suki-suki natin dito sa programa natin. No? I-patronize po yung okay, tindahan po namin. Okay, may mag-commit na po yung anak ko. Okay, itong okay, BP for operation, sabi niya, sundin ko ang legacy mo, Papa. Okay, yung BP for operation sa corporation, ayan, sabi niya, huwag ka mag-alala, Papa, mawala ka man sa daigdig, ang legacy mo ay sundin ko, mga kababayan. Sundin daw niya. Okay, sabi ko, salamat. Ayan. Siya po ang BP for operation, magpatakbo po ng negosyo, ako ay wala na. Okay, pakuan-kuan na lang mga kababayan, no? Hindi na talagang pagod na po ang inyong abang lingkod, mga kababayan, no? Mga suki natin. Ito lang microphone ay ayaw ko talaga bitawan pa. Ayan. Okay, meron BP for treasurer, meron BP for finance, BP for treasurer, at saka itong mga mga kasusyo natin po sa negosyo. Pamilya po, puro pamilya, mga kababayan. Okay, puro anak. Ayan, anak lahat. Okay, mga apo natin, no? Okay, mga apo ko. Okay, kasama po rito sa corporation ito, mga kababayan, no? Yung Mind of Global Food Lines, mga apo ko. Okay, may stake po rito sa corporation, mga kababayan, no? Meron sila share. I-invest nila ang pera nila. Okay, dito po sa corporation, mga apo ko. Okay lang apo ko. Isa, dalawa. Okay. Isa. Tatlo na. Isa. Dalawa. 5 na. And then isa, dalawa, tatlo. 8 na po lahat. Lahat yon may stake po rito sa corporation, mga kababayan, na. Okay, may share sila. Okay, mawala man ako, mawala kung sino mawala sa amin. Kasi, okay, non-expiration po ang binigay po ng Security Exchange Commission po dito sa corporation ito, na. Walang expiration. Kung mawala ako, papalit lang kung sino-sino ng mga progeny ko, mga kababayan, na. Yon lang ang iwan ko sa kanila, itong negosyo, mga suki, no? Okay, complete na negosyo, wala na po problema, no? Ayan. So, pati apo ko, meron stake dito. Binigyan ko sila ng, share po, mga apo ko rito sa corporation, no? Okay, kami-kami lang. Pamilya po, mga kababayan. Basta, lineage ko, okay, galing sa aking dugo, galing sa aking anak, okay, tuloy-tuloy po ay kanila itong corporation, no? Okay. Hindi na po yung mga labas, hindi na. Halimbawa, mga kamag-anak, hindi na po, mga kababayan. Basta sa lineage ko, sa linyada ko, galing po sa dugo ng lolo nila, lolong kalbo, kasama po rito sa corporation, mga kababayan, na. Hindi na outsider. Kasi observation ko, pag mga magsama-sama po, magkagulo mga corporation, no? Okay, hindi po maganda. Pero kung dugo mo, pamilya mo, ayos na ayos po, mga kababayan. So mag-commit ang anak ko, yung BP for operation, siya po magmando ng negosyo. Sabi niya, okay, huwag ka mag-alala, tatay, kung wala ka na, ayan, sunduin ko ang legasya mo sa pagpunyagi mo sa amin, mga kababayan, na. Okay, sabi po ng anak ko. Sabi ko, alhamdulillah. Okay, may nakakuha po ng aking kung ano laman po ng utak ko, mga kababayan, no? Yung mga anak ko. Ayan. Okay, yon ang maganda. Yon po ang maganda. Okay, tama na. Mga suki, mga kababayan. Okay, wala tayong masamang tinapay sa kapwa, no? Okay, sure 100% wala tayong masama. Okay, mga komentaryo ko, ganun lang yon. Okay, pero aral para sa inyo po mga kababayan, no? Masaktan man kayo sa katotohanan, okay, aral po sa inyo ang mga binitawan ko rito sa microphone ko mga kababayan. Katulad mga facade, ay sinasabi ko yung mga mass corruption, okay, graft and corruption, facade, under facade, okay, yung mass killing, under facade, mass, yung mga pang-sindikato sa kapwa, okay, sabi na sa yakan akal tipu, ay mga aral ko sa inyo yun, under facade mga kababayan, no? Okay, marami itong okay, marami itong coverage mo ng facade sa Suratul Isra mga kababayan, no? Ayan. Okay. So, ayan po, inuulit ko, wala akong masamang tinampay, paalam na ako para ma-close na po ang programa. This has been Abs Damahan lamang po sa gabing ito, no? Araw ng Huwebes. Okay, babalik tayo bukas ng uwang. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Ayan. Okay, mga suki, mga nakikinig. Okay, mga suki, no? Okay, pwede makisali, no? Kung maging public listed na ang Mindep Global po Food Lines Corporation, no? Okay, pag makaabot ako ng mga 50 million kapital, okay, pala pataas-taas pa, okay, mag-public listed na po company itong, okay, itong, sabi man ni ano, no? Sabi man ni Attorney Emil Aquino po ng CPA, ng Security Exchange Commission, kailangan pa ay mag-restructure, okay, mang Mind of Global Food Lines mga kababayan, no? Sundin po yung mga checklist, ayan po ng corporate checklist, okay, para maging public listed company po sa, okay, Philippine Stock Exchange Index. Yan po sa Makati mga kababayan, no? Sundin lang. Compliance lang. Trabaho lang ng abogado yan. Sandali lang po mga at saka accountant, no? Kaya. Pero kailangan meron na kung okay, abot po ng mga 50 million po ang kapital ko mga kababayan, no? Kung papasok sana ang itong mga Sharia banking institution o kaya mga finance Islamic institution, madali lang yun pa mga kababayan, no? Okay, kasi may asset. Okay, may asset po itong Mind of Global Food Lines Corporation, no? Ayan. May asset na mga real property. Okay, itong corporation mga kababayan, no? Ayan. Madali. Kung nagawa po ng BARM government, may meron mga Islamic institution para sa finance, okay, madali po makapasok itong corporation natin, no? Kasi kompleto. Ayan. So, yon po. Talagang paalam na po mga kababayan, no? Kasi kung makahawak ko ng microphone, mahirap matigil, no? Ayan.
Ang programa ito ay public service sa makahamilan at
Okay, close na natin, no? Kasi pag hindi pa ma-close, ay hindi matapos.